In this video, we're going to discuss how to find the roots of an equation by factoring. First thing, don't be thrown off by the word roots. Remember, roots just means find the solutions to the equations, okay? Find the values of x that satisfy the equation, okay? So we're going to use factoring to do this. So first thing I'm going to do is make one side of the equation equal 0. So to do that, I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides of the equation. And I'll end up with 2x squared plus 9x minus 5 equals 0. Okay, before moving on, I'm going to go ahead and look at all my terms quickly, see if there's anything common amongst my terms, and see if there's anything that I can pull out. You notice that there's an x here, an x there, no x here. Next to the 5, there's no x. So x is not common amongst all three terms, so there's nothing I can do to pull out anything. So I'm going to have to go through other methods in order to be able to factor. I can't just factor here in the first step. There's nothing common that I'm able to pull out. Alright, so to factor this, I'm going to, first thing I'm going to do is take the 2, okay, and the 5. Now the 2 and the 5, remember this, if I were to say this is the standard form of a quadratic equation, so ax squared plus bx plus c. So basically what I'm saying is I want to multiply the a times the c, okay? So the 2 times the negative 5, that equals negative 10. Okay, so now I'm going to make a table over here. Factors of negative 10. And then I want to do the sum of the factors. And the goal is to find the sum of the factors. The goal is to find it equal to whatever the term b is. And so in our equation, that would be 9. Okay, so factors of negative 10. First, there's 1 and negative 10. There's also 10 and negative 1. There's 2 and 5, negative 5 and 2. Okay, and so let's do sum of the factors. So I'm looking for when it's going to equal 9. I go here, 1 minus 10, that's negative 9. 10 minus 1, that's 9. Okay, so I can stop there. That's the one I was looking for. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this 9 into those two factors. Okay, so I'm going to break this 9 into 10x minus 1x. And I'm going to rewrite the equation 2x squared plus and then minus 5. Okay, so I haven't changed the equation anyway. The 9x is now 10x minus 1, but it's the same equation. Okay, so now I'm going to look for like terms in this side and like terms on this side. Okay, so I'm basically breaking it up into two different pieces and looking for like terms for me to factor out. So what's common amongst these two terms? What's common amongst these two terms? Well, there's an x that's common, and there's also a 2 that's common. Okay, so I can go ahead and pull that out. I'll be left with, so I'm going to pull out the 2x, and what will I be left with? I'll be left with a 1x there, right? And then plus, and then if I took out a 2x from 10x, then I'm going to be left with just 5, right? So you can see how if I were to distribute this again, I would have 2x squared, right? If I were to take this 2x and multiply by x, I'd be left with 2x squared. And if we were to take this 2x and multiply by 5, I'd be left with 10x. Okay. And then for the next one, I'm going to do this one in black. There's what's common amongst these two terms. There's a negative sign that's common amongst both those terms, right? Okay, so I'm going to pull out a negative sign. And then I'll be left with an x, and I'll be left with a positive 5 if I pulled out the negative sign. Okay, so now notice that this term and this term are common. So I can pull them out. I can factor that. Okay, so I'm going to pull that out over here. So I'm going to be having x plus 5 over here. And then over here, I would be left with this 2x. And then basically this is a minus 1 that's in front of this term. So 2x minus 1. Okay? Now you see how if I were to take this and distribute it into the 2x and then the 1, I would be left with what I had previously. I'd be left with this. Okay, if I took this and distributed it, I would have 2x times this, and then minus 1 times this, which is exactly what you see up here. Okay, so that equals 0. Okay, so lastly, I noticed that if this piece here were to equal 0, if 2x minus 1 were to equal 0, then the whole thing would equal 0, because anything times 0 is 0. Right? And if x plus 5 were to equal 0, then the whole thing would equal 0 because anything times 0 is 0. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to set up both those. So 2x plus 1, if that were to equal 0, we would have a solution to the equation. And then if x plus 5 were to equal 0, we would have a solution to the equation. So now let's just solve both those pieces. So I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides here, negative 1, and then divide both sides by 2, and I'll have x equals negative 1/2. Okay, then I'm going to have subtract 5 from both sides, x equals negative 5. Okay, so then you would say your solution set, you always start with the smaller number when you're writing your solution set, so negative 5 and then negative 1/2. Okay, and that would be your solution set for this equation. Okay, so moving on to another example. We're going to do this in a very similar fashion to the previous example. First thing I'm going to do is take what's on the right-hand side of the equation and move it over to the left so that I have 0 on one side of the equation. So I'm going to have 5x squared. Now if I were to subtract, or I would add 16x to both sides, right? So plus 16x. And then I would add 3 to both sides in order to get a 0 on this side of the equation. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to do the same thing where I make my table, and I'm going to do that over here to the right. I'm going to say factors of basically this a term times the c term. So that's factors of 15. Okay. And then the sum of the factors, and the goal is to find when it is 16. Okay. So the goal is 16. So factors of 15, there's 1 and 15. There's 3 and 5. Okay, there's also negative 1 and negative 15, negative 3 and negative 5. We don't really have to list them all out. We could start by just finding some of the sums, and the first one would have had the right sum, so I could have just stopped there. Okay, so there we go. 1 and 15 gets the sum of 16. So that's what we wanted. So I'm going to break this 16 out into 2 pieces, the 16x into 2 pieces. I'm going to break it out into 1x and plus 15x. Okay, then everything else stays the same. 5x squared plus, and then plus 3. Okay, so see, I didn't change the equation when I went from this step to this step. I just broke the 16 into 2 different pieces. All right, and then, so now I'm going to look at this equation in 2 different pieces. And is there anything common amongst this first piece that I can pull out? Well, it looks like there's only an x that I can pull out. So I'm going to pull out an x. I'll be left with a 5, an x, and then plus 1. Anything common I can pull out here? Yes, there's a 3 I can pull out. So I'm going to do that, 3. And then I'll have, oops. Then I'll have a 5x plus 1 left over. Okay? Now, you see these 2 terms are the same. Now, these 2 terms will always be the same as long as you did this table correctly. Okay? So, if you did the table correctly, these 2 terms will be the same. So now you can pull them out. Okay? And so I'm going to pull them out to this side. So I'll have 5x plus 1 over here, and then what am I left with? I would need to multiply that 5x plus 1 by leftover x, okay, and the leftover plus 3. Okay, now if either one of those terms is 0, the whole thing is 0, so let's go ahead and do that. X plus 3 equals 0. Solve that, so subtract 3 from both sides. X equals negative 3. 5x plus 1, if this were to equal 0, subtract 1 from both sides. Divide both sides by x, or by 5, negative 1/5. Okay, so here's your solution set. You always start with the smaller number. Okay, you write your solution set in order. Okay, so negative 3 is smaller than negative 1/5. Okay, and then there you go. There's your solution set. All right, so now last factoring example. So I'm going to start same way I started all the other ones, which is by making one side of the equation 0. I'm going to subtract 4x from both sides. Okay, so now I'm gonna pause here for a second. I'm gonna see if there's any anything that's common amongst the terms that I can go ahead and factor right away, and I can see immediately there's a y that is common, okay, and there's also a 4 that is common. I can pull out 4 from both these terms, okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. 4y, and I'll be left with a 2 and a y, right? Because 4y times 2y is 8y squared, okay? And then minus, I'll be left with just 1 there, right? Because 4y times negative 1 is negative 4y, okay? And then so this equals 0. So from here, I can go ahead and say, okay, so if 4y equal to 0, the whole thing would equal 0. If 2y minus 1 would equal 0, the whole thing would equal 0. So I can go ahead and break it down from here. 4y equals 0, 2y minus 1 equals 0, okay? So over here I'm going to divide both sides by 4. 0 divided by 4 is 0, so y equals 0 is the solution. And over here I'm going to add 1 to both sides, divide both sides by 2. Okay, so there we go. There's my solution set, 0 and 1/2.